was interesting to say the least, but worth it.
Good for you.
It was worth it. I got my photo. And we're live. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Denver Startup Week. And I am waiting for a volunteer to come in and thank the sponsors. And if that doesn't happen in a minute or two, welcome to Fireside Chat with Brad Feld. My name is Dave Mayer, and I am a longtime passionate community builder. And here we go with the sponsors.
Welcome to Denver Startup Week. I'm Tammy Dorr, President and CEO of the Downtown Denver Partnership and co-chair of Denver Startup Week. This year marks the 10-year anniversary of Denver Startup Week. DSW has been the catalyst for lots of change over the past decade. And this week, we're coming together to celebrate the past and dream big for the future. We are able to bring Denver Startup Week to this community thanks to our 2021 sponsors. Thank you to our HQ and title sponsor, Amazon, and our title sponsors whose leadership makes this week come to life. Capital One Cafe, Downtown Denver Partnership, Fluid Truck, Hotel Engine, and WeWork. And our track sponsors who have made all of the great content you're hearing today possible, our founder track sponsor, Kickstart, growth track sponsor, Friday Health Plans, developer track sponsor, Quizlet, product track sponsor, Palantir, our designer track sponsor, Battery 621, and the Public Works, people track sponsor, Exactly, and spotlight event sponsor, Strat Labs. Our headline event sponsors are bringing the excitement to the week. Thank you to B-Side Fund, Colorado Public Radio, Comcast, Coors Brewing, Denver Pavilions, Entrepreneurship at the University of Denver, JP Morgan Chase, Method, Moss Adams, Pi Insurance, Promontory Mortgage, Path, Southwest, Tattered Cover, and VF Venture Foundry. Finally, thank you to our partner and member sponsors, all listed on the screen. Please say thank you to these companies as you enjoy our hybrid Denver Startup Week. And don't forget, use the hashtag DenStartupWeek to share your experiences and moments of inspiration on social media. Have a great week.
Awesome.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Denver Startup Week. I'm John, the Spotlight Track Chair and member of the Denver Startup Week Organizing Committee. Before we get started, the Denver Startup Week Organizing Committee acknowledges Indigenous people as the original owners of the land on which we reside, which is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide, ethnic cleansing, stolen land, forced removal, forced occupation of their territory. And we honor those who have stewarded this land throughout generations and all other indigenous tribes and nations who call Colorado home. Thank you for joining us for the 10th anniversary of Denver Startup Week. At Denver Startup Week, we strive to make all of our sessions a space where attendees can connect, learn, and grow, regardless of age, gender identity, gender expression, race, ability, sexual orientation, or the combination of those identities. There is something for everyone at DSW. Thanks to all of our community members who submitted their best content to make this week what it is. And thank you for joining us. Thank you to our sponsors for their support in helping us keep DSW free and accessible for all, especially our Spotlight track sponsor, Strat Labs. With that, please enjoy this session and the entire week.
All right, welcome. Thanks to Brad and thanks to all the organizers of Denver Startup Week. It is pretty amazing that we've reached the 10th Denver Startup Week here. Exciting. Welcome to Fireside Chat with Brad Feld. My name is Dave Mayer. I am longtime community builder, spent 20 years in Boulder around the startup ecosystem, helping to bring people together around the Give First ethos. I run a small boutique business called Technical Integrity, and we focus on building diverse executive and engineering teams in Colorado and beyond. I am grateful for my good friend, mentor, and amazing human, Brad Feld, for being here to talk about his new book. And we'll get into that in a moment. I'm sure most of you know that Brad is the co-founder of Techstars, philanthropist alongside his wife, Amy Batchelor, as well as the co-founder and managing director of Founder Group with more than $2 billion under management. His new book, The Entrepreneur's Weekly Nietzsche, co-written by Dave Jilk, or with Dave Jilk, and coined a book for disruptors. So we'll dig in. But first, sort of start at the beginning. I would love for you to talk about how this book came about, and of course, the pronunciation of the philosopher's name for starters.
Well, the name is Nietzsche, and Friederich Nietzsche is a German philosopher from the 19th century. Most of his writing was kind of 1850, 1860 to 1880. He eventually sort of lost his mind by about 1890 and then died in 1900. So that time frame. The book came about through a series of conversations. Dave Jilk was my first business partner. Dave and I started a company in 1987, a very uncreatively named company. It's called Feld Technologies. I learned an important lesson, which is you should never name your company after yourself, because when someone is unhappy, they call for Mr. Feld, not for Mr. Jilk, even if he was the one who caused them to be unhappy. But we were partners for 7 years. We were also best friends, and we were best friends from college. He was a senior when I was a freshman. So we only lived together for a year, but we became very, very close. And today, 35 years, almost 40 years later, actually, we are still best friends, extremely close. We've had our ups and downs, plenty of challenges over the years, but a really deep relationship. Some of you may know Dave. He lives in Boulder now. He moved to Boulder almost 20 years ago, I think, and has been a multi-time entrepreneur, and now is semi-retired, still involved in a couple of companies, but mostly enjoys what he wants to enjoy rather than work on a particular thing. For many years, Amy and I had a place at Keystone, and we had told our friends, a ski place we used on the weekends mostly. We told our friends, hey, if y'all ever want to use it, just come out. And Dave and his wife Maureen took us seriously, so they were out probably about once a month, which was delightful. And we would often just lay around and read. About 2012, 13, Dave has started to go deep on a number of philosophers, one of them being Nietzsche. And he starts tossing out Nietzsche quotes at me and just says, hey, Brad, does that sound like entrepreneurship to you? And I'm sure the first 10 times he did that, I just continued to read my book and paid no attention to him and just said something like, uh-huh. But eventually, like, we started talking about some of these quotes. And this is, again, a philosopher from the 19th century who, my first reaction when Dave said Nietzsche was a very classical, uninformed one was, isn't that the philosopher who was a Nazi? Demonstrating that I knew almost nothing about Nietzsche other than sort of one thing. It's worth everybody here knowing I'm Jewish. And so sort of the reaction to, Nietzsche as that frame of reference, before I was really even comfortable seriously exploring it, I wanted to understand that history some. That played out over a couple of years where we just sort of had these long conversations about these quotes that Dave had been pulling out from the original Nietzsche that he was reading as he went really, really deep. And at some point we said, let's do a project together. Let's try to write a book that deconstructs some of these quotes in the context of entrepreneurship, that causes people to and provokes people to think about entrepreneurship. And the last sort of part of that beginning story of it was really driven by Ryan Holiday, who has written a number of books about Stoicism and particularly applied Stoicism to entrepreneurship. I think Ryan's books are spectacular. He's become a good friend. And he had, I think in 2015 or 16, came out with a book called The Daily Stoic, which I have a copy of in the bathroom, and I read each day whatever that day's page is. And it's a quote from, a famous Stoic philosopher. And then Ryan's kind of 2 to 5 paragraph interpretation and application of the quote. And Dave and I decided to use that as a sort of conceptual framework for how we would try to approach linking Nietzsche to entrepreneurship.
So you mentioned at the top that, and both in your book and here, that Nietzsche could be perceived as both troubling and troublesome. So why choose a perceived troublesome figure, and what was the homework that you did to figure out that obviously he was misperceived in a lot of cases?
So the foreword to the book is written by Reid Hoffman, who I expect most of you know as an extremely successful entrepreneur, the chair, co-founder, and ultimately the chair of LinkedIn, and now a partner at Greylock. Reid and I sat on the board of Zynga together from 2007 to 2010, when Zynga went from about 10 people to a couple of thousand people in that time period, and then went public. So I got to know Reid well and really liked him. And I knew that Reid had deep philosophical education in his background. And so when I started exploring Nietzsche, he was one of the people I reached out to with the idea that we might do a book around this. And Reid's immediate response was unambiguous, strong, positive. And he actually coined the phrase that we use in the book, that Nietzsche is the patron philosopher of entrepreneurs. And the troubling and troublesome language is Reid's from the foreword, in that it's actually how a lot of entrepreneurs are perceived, in their disruptive activity, which is that they are disruptive. They can be troubling and troublesome. And the dynamics around it is challenging. Nietzsche, as I started to learn about him as a person and the history, I chased down and with Dave's help really explored a number of the things that had surfaced, which included at the time a lot about Nietzsche's background, for example, as a Nazi, which was just not true. Nietzsche, again, died in 1900. Turns out his sister was a Nazi, and she inherited his literary corpus when he died, and as a result, repurposed some of it and applied it, and it became popular in the context of the Third Reich. But in fact, if you read Nietzsche and dig into it, he not only abhorred nationalism in general, and he was stateless for the last 20 or so years of his life, where he gave up his nationality and literally belonged to no country. But the whole notion of him being anti-Semitic was nonsensical, because he would often write about his hatred of anti-Semitism. And so there's this interesting things where, if you don't dig into the source and understand it, it's something that happens to all of us in contemporary society, but it's the meta of just sort of seeing what you heard. One of the things that came up in 2017, 2018, I guess, was that Nietzsche had become adopted as a philosopher for the alt-right. And Dave and I went looking for how did that happen? Where did that come from? And it turns out that it's mostly clickbait, that, there's an article that made the linkage, didn't actually even quote Nietzsche correctly, but made the linkage to Richard Spencer, and then, built from there. So that's the kind of work we did, like actual original research and source material to understand it. More importantly, though, this notion of disruptor and entrepreneurs as disruptor is very parallel to what Nietzsche was in his time. He was an extremely disruptive philosopher. And I like to think of him as the bridge between classical philosophy that came from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and was very much sort of classical European Western philosophy of that era, the 1700s, 1800s, and the shift to contemporary philosophy, that started kind of early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. And in some ways was more global, included the US, included not just Europe as sort of the core focal point, but North and South America, and sort of broader philosophical views that went just beyond simple philology and philosophy. Nietzsche is known for his aphorisms, his sort of very, very strong statements, which in many ways are beautiful and poetic and very powerful. And they're not necessarily ones that you can deconstruct and say, oh, I should do that, but rather they're ones that make you think. And so he took a very, very different approach to philosophy. It was described that he philosophizes with a hammer. And again, the disruptive nature of that, which is to just be very, very aggressive with the language, provoking, provocative, willing to take chances with it, willing to contradict himself, and very much out of the mainstream. And really, all of that was his own effort to search for, cliche-ishly, I think some people apply this notion of the meaning of life. Like, what does this all mean? Which at some sense is at the root of a lot of philosophical inquiry. Again, very parallel to the notion of entrepreneurs when they say things that, cliche-ishly are, I want to change the world. Like, what's the meaning of this thing that we're actually doing? So we found so many parallels, or we're able to, frankly, intuit parallels from the late 1800s to contemporary society in terms of the disruptive dynamics that were occurring then in the world that Nietzsche was at the center of, and again, occurring today in the world that entrepreneurs are often very involved in and at the center of.
Yeah, love it. And for those of you in the audience that want to hear and learn more about Nietzsche's life and legacy, there are some appendixes available, as well as sort of some of these misperceived affiliations. It goes in depth in the book on that. I was glad to hear that you found Nietzsche a little hard to read at first. That made me feel a little better. It's not easy necessarily on the first pass in all cases, right? It takes some time to sink in, right? And so why don't you talk just briefly about how the book is organized, and then we can dig in on a couple of the quotes specifically.
Yeah, well, I think the beauty of Nietzsche in a lot of ways is to recognize that what you're reading when you read a Nietzsche quote is an English translation of something written in German in the mid to late 1800s. And in the book, all of our translations are public domain. So many of them are, 100 years old or sort of bordering on that. And so one of the things we did was we translated the English translations into what we thought was 21st century English. When I encounter a Nietzsche quote, or when I read Nietzsche, I read it the same way I read poetry. And if you haven't read poetry or are turned off by poetry or have never really engaged with it, one of the things that is important about poetry is to savor it and to let the words generate meaning for you rather than try to read it and get the meaning from the words. And so, when I'm reading poetry, I'll often read it very slowly. I'll read it out loud. Think about, and if you're not into poetry, think about song lyrics and how you relate to song lyrics, which is not that you read them, but that you kind of memorize them. You kind of learn the song lyrics and you kind of learn the music, and it starts to have more meaning as the words sit with you for longer. That's Nietzsche. The structure of the book is weekly instead of daily. So 52 Nietzsche quotes. We decided the world did not need us to try to interpret 365 Nietzsche quotes. And maybe more selfishly, Dave and I decided we didn't have the ability or the energy to do that. So we have one a week. It's intended that you read one a week, although you can read it from beginning to end. So we structured the book in 5 sections. And within each section, we've sort of loosely ordered the quotes so that there's some coherence, but not a lot. We then start with a Nietzsche quote. We then rewrite it in what we think is 21st century English. We then have a 2 to 5 page essay from us, Dave and I, about applying that quote to entrepreneurship. The essay is very intended to be thought-provoking. It is not at all intended to be directive. We're not trying to say you should do this and you should do that. If you want to get that kind of information, there are now 10,000 VC bloggers blogging about what you should do, which I find not that useful in the grand scheme of things. I think it's much better. And when I think about what I wanted as an entrepreneur, was not for somebody to tell me the answer, but for somebody to provoke different lines of thought and to give me some guidance for ways to think about things and some examples, but still allow me to go deep myself on the particular topic. And then for about 2/3 of them, we have an example from an entrepreneur that they came up with from their own experience, but after reading the quote and our translation of the quote, we did not try to guide them. They're more like blog posts, lightly edited, mostly just to make the commas and the periods be in the right places, but all very much first person experiential. Again, what that Nietzsche quote made them think of from their own experience.
Yeah.
And as Dave said, at the end of the book, we do have a couple of sections. We have a brief history on Nietzsche. We have a chapter talking about all the things that, you think about, that you might have heard about Nietzsche that are wrong, sort of supporting them and helping understand the context of it. One example is you'll often, especially today, see people have a reaction to Nietzsche and describe his writing as him specifically, not necessarily his writing, but him as misogynistic and very sexist and not gender aware. He had a complex relationship with women. It's actually, if you read his history, you see that he struggled a lot, but in a not obvious way from a power perspective, because he was taken care of by a couple of women more than anything else. Interestingly, if you go back and put yourself in that time period, 1850 to 1890, the cultural norms in that time period, he was very much sort of in line with. If anything, he was maybe progressive for that time period with regard to gender behavior. So, we try to talk about that stuff, not being defensive of Nietzsche, but just trying to very simply explain it. Last comment is, this is not a book about Nietzsche. It's a book about entrepreneurs. It's a book about disruption. It's a book intended to provoke you to think, to stimulate discussion, not to give you answers, but to give you some different things to play around with that Dave and I thought were important and relevant in the context of entrepreneurship.
Well, that's a perfect segue. I've chosen a handful of quotes to talk about and for us to philosophize on, and certainly for those of you who have questions, please throw them in the chat and we will get to those here in a bit. But I wanted to start on page 181 in your hymnal. Gratitude and integrity. Obviously, my company is called Technical Integrity, so we live and die by our namesake of having integrity in everything we do. And the Nietzsche quote is, "A man of genius is unbearable unless he possesses at least two things besides gratitude and purity." And your, in other words, summary is, nobody likes a person who is smart, but isn't honest and nice. And I'll let you reflect on that. What stood out for me was in Dave's little summary towards the end of that, reflecting on it, was this is a reflection of integrity of oneself, not just necessarily towards other, but keeping yourself, your own integrity intact, not just sort of external, but internal.
This is one of the shorter Nietzsche quotes, but I'm going to read it again because I want to make sure everybody hears the emphasis, because this is an important part of this. Having read, even though it's a short quote, having read it a bunch of times and having thought about it, I'm going to put the emphasis a little different than where Dave did. A man of genius is unbearable unless he possesses at least two things besides: gratitude and purity. And in other words, is simple. Nobody likes a person who is smart, but isn't honest and nice. So, if you play around with that, these two words are really important ones. Gratitude is an easy word, I think, for us to interpret today. Purity is a different word. And one of the things that Dave and I spent some time on was when we saw a word like purity and tried to apply it to entrepreneurship, we thought pretty hard about what we thought the analogous contemporary entrepreneurial word was. And here the word is integrity. And, you know, if you ponder it, we are surrounded in the world of entrepreneurship by very smart people, many, many, many very smart people. And some of them we work for, some of them work for us, some of them are partners, some of them are colleagues, some of them are competitors. One of the languages that often comes up, especially in early stage entrepreneurship, especially in startup communities, is some version of a rule that another VC gave me many, many years ago, which was a no asshole rule. And, you know, this notion, this investor basically said, look, I just don't want to work with assholes. There's some brilliant assholes. I just don't want to work with them. And it doesn't mean that you can't be successful or that you're not smart, but nobody likes you. And there's this positive feedback loop when you have both gratitude and integrity. And the key dynamic of gratitude is not just gratitude for others, but also self-gratitude, appreciation for your strengths and weaknesses, gratitude for yourself in the context of your relationship with others, but gratitude for others with regard to their relationship to you. I think Dave and I are a good, Dave Mayer and I are a good example of that. You know, we have a good friendship. It's gone on for a long time. I think it would be easy for Dave to get frustrated with me when I say I'm too busy, or I just don't have the emotional energy for that right now, or, you know, I just don't feel like it. But he has enough gratitude for me, but also enough to recognize that I need to have time and space for myself, hence gratitude for myself, to be able to engage and be fully present. And so when I'm not, that's okay. It's a both way street. Integrity in some ways, you know, is the same. I mean, I personally have a very, very deeply held belief that lying is intolerable. And it comes from my own personal experiences of being lied to early on in my adulthood. And I would use the word lie very deliberately. I make a lot, and I'll use me as an example. I make a lot of mistakes. I'm comfortable that I make a lot of mistakes and will continue to make a lot of mistakes. I get a lot of things wrong. I misinterpret a lot of things. There are plenty of things that happen that I think are going a certain way, and people don't tell me what's actually going on because of whatever the, you know, position or power dynamics are. I do not think I lie. And I separate that from even the white lies, the little exaggerations. Do I misinterpret something? Do I sell aggressively? Absolutely. But do I step over a line where I'm literally not holding myself with integrity? No, I try not to. And if I ever do, and somebody calls me on it, I own it and say, I'm sorry. I don't say I'm sorry for how you interpreted it, or I'm sorry for how I made you feel. It's like, I'm sorry. And just own my own lack of integrity in those moments, because we all make mistakes. So it's this dynamic of if you feel that way towards others, and I should say a different way. If you expect others to behave that way, you have to feel that way towards them as well. In both of these two examples.
So this is also a perfect segue to my next quote, which is on page 61, the trust quote that our friend Ingrid Alonji did an afterword for. But the quote is, or do you prefer to read it, Brad?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read it. And I saw Ingrid was on the call, and I just skimmed through the list. So Ingrid, if you're there, thank you for doing. If you ended up joining, thank you for contributing to the book and for doing this. And I don't know if we can bring her up on stage if she's here, Dave, to maybe talk about her example. But I'll read the quote. I am affected, not because you have deceived me, but because I can no longer believe in you. In other words, I'm not upset that you lied to me. I'm upset that I can never trust you again or think highly of you. And again, if you link this to the previous one, right? Like, we all make mistakes. It's a very, very different dynamic to purposefully deceive someone else. And when you purposefully deceive someone else in a business context, it's not a moralistic judgment. I'm not making a judgment of the other person. One can, but that's not the point. The point is that once that happens, you can't undo it. And there's another cliche that's you often see, which is you can't unspeak something. Right? Once I've said something to someone that's hurtful, I can't take it back. I can apologize, but I can't take it back. It's still there. And in the context of trust, especially in the context of trust in a key relationship where you're really trying to build and develop that trust over time, you can have a long arc of trust destroyed in one moment with a serious deceit. This is the Warren Buffett famous quote. And John asked, is this a session about Nietzsche? And the answer is yes, you're in the right session. It happens to be about entrepreneurship, but it's got some Nietzsche in it too. The Warren Buffett quote is something like, a reputation is built over a lifetime and destroyed in one moment. And I didn't get the quote quite right, but you get the meaning of it. And this just reinforces this. I mean, as entrepreneurs, it is so quick to be destroyed. And I want to give a real life example. The real life example, some people may know what happened with the business Aussie in the last week. This was a business that, if you're not familiar with it, a New York Times article came out at the beginning of the week, and by the end of the week, the company has gone out of business. Complete fraud, a series of fraudulent things that occurred that, kind of destroyed it. I got a request from a New York Times writer. I haven't seen the article yet, so I have no idea whether I was constructive in my response or not. But New York Times writer sent me a note saying, this is going on, and they tied it back to Theranos and what's going on with the Elizabeth Holmes trial, and said, what do you think of the fake it till you make it language that's so prevalent within entrepreneurship, and especially in Silicon Valley? And I said, I find it deplorable. I despise it. And I despise it because I think it causes people to behave in a way that is not trustworthy. And there's nothing wrong with being aspirational. There's nothing wrong with describing where you think you're going to get to. There's nothing wrong with selling a vision of what you have. But it's very different between that and saying that's what's going on. If you don't have those things, you have to qualify it by saying that it's aspirational, or saying that it's your vision, or saying that that's where you're going. But to represent reality as something that's a fiction, to fake it, not a constructive way to be.
Looks like Ingrid may have had to go look after her twins. So
hi, Ingrid. Anyway, I'll just give the quick in the book to give people a feeling for it. We start each narrative. The narrative starts a narrative from Ingrid Alongi, co-founder, Quick Left. And I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs. In the months prior to the sale of my business, I found myself in an unfortunate situation. A person I had trusted by default rather than through long experience violated my trust. Luckily, I was alerted to these deceptions by people who respected me. I had a difficult time figuring out how to deal with the situation. First, I had begun with high hopes that the working relationship with this person would be mutually beneficial. Second, I had made myself financially vulnerable through certain arrangements that exposed me personally. Third, the condition of the business was not ideal, with significant debt and volatile cash flow. To top it off, I was pregnant with twins. It is one thing to trust a new working relationship and be a little vulnerable. I was learning why it is important to limit that vulnerability. And this is about a 3-page story. And I'll just, I'll end with the last paragraph. My biggest mistake was not insisting on crucial changes to the personal financial exposure I had prior to entering into the business arrangement. Things were moving quickly and, by design, as I later learned, pushing me to trust that the changes would get done in time instead of insisting they get done before anything else moved forward. I let my excitement and optimism around the new arrangement and its potential cloud my judgment, setting myself up for a potentially dangerous situation later. As someone who likes to move fast, I learned yet again that sometimes you need to slow down. If someone is pushing you to make a decision quickly, it's worth questioning why that is and to whom it ultimately benefits.
Yeah. Thank you. Going to take a little bit of a left turn to work as a reward, something that I've been focusing on personally on page 122. Would you like to read the quote or would you like me to?
Yeah, I'll go for it. So this is I described earlier that we broke the book into 5 sections. And the 5 sections, just so people have it, are strategy, culture, free spirits, leadership, and tactics. And this is in the free spirit section. And Nietzsche uses free spirits a lot as not an idealization of the way people behave, but as a virtuous set of values, this notion of being a free spirit. And he didn't apply it to business people at the time. And in fact, one could suggest that Nietzsche would have been very sort of disdainful, or was very disdainful of business people. But at the time, the dynamic of what a business person was is very different than what an entrepreneur is today. And Reed, Dave, and I, as we talked about it, all feel like Nietzsche would actually view entrepreneurs in the very positive category, especially because of this association with behavior as free spirits. In this quote, I think this is a relatively easy one to process, but I think also worded really well. But still, there are rarer men who would rather perish than work without delight in their labor. I'm gonna read that again. And it's longer than this, but I just want everybody to get the first clause. But still, there are rarer men who would rather perish than work without delight in their labor. The fastidious people, difficult to satisfy, whose object is not served by an abundant profit, unless the work itself be the reward of all rewards. Just ponder the cliche that I'm sure everybody on this call has heard, the journey is the reward. And then, in other words, is there are rare individuals who would rather die than work without enjoyment. Such people are very particular about the quality of the work, and making money is secondary to the reward of the work itself. And this one's powerful. I mean, as an entrepreneur for many years, as an investor for many years, there's lots of stuff that I do on a daily basis that I'm not that interested in doing, but that I have to do. It's just the overhead of this thing called life and this overhead of this thing called work or entrepreneurship. However, if that was all I had and I made a ton of money from it, but 100% of my work time was on things that I wasn't really that interested in doing, I wouldn't do it. And in fact, the thing that causes me to continue to do it is the deep love, the deep joy, the deep satisfaction, the intense reward I get from the aspects of it that I find fulfilling. And I'm going to go back to that first line because it's so good to me.
And then let's talk about the Judd story after you read the first line.
But still, there are rare men who would rather perish than work without delight in their labor. And Judd Valesky wrote the narrative. He was the founder of GNIP. Today, he describes himself, I think, as, at least the way we have in the book, photographer and angel investor. I was Judd's investor from the very beginning. I invested when Judd was co-founder with somebody named Eric Marcoulier. And, they went through a period of time where they struggled to get the business working. And at some point, Eric decided to leave, left on very good terms, actually was incredibly graceful about his decision to leave. Judd went from CTO to CEO and was CEO for a while. The business took off, and pretty quickly Judd and I realized that Judd would benefit from a partner that had a lot of experience on the business side. Chris Moody joined and ultimately partnered with Judd, and then ultimately became the CEO. And some of you may know Moody as a partner, one of my partners now at Foundry Group. He was at Twitter after GNIP got bought by Twitter, and was ran the data business for Twitter for 3 years. This story starts with, after becoming CEO of GNIP, so this was after Eric had left, and the business was really struggling. Like, it was not clear it was going to survive, let alone become successful. I learned of a deal that had recently been signed without my knowledge. I immediately dove in to understand what we'd signed up for. I found the deal to be very lucrative for us. However, it would take our product and engineering team away from our core product vision, and instead essentially dedicate us to working on functionality that the other party needed in their product. For all intents and purposes, the deal would, I was smiling at myself because Judd got intents and purposes correct. Most people don't. And we didn't have to edit it. For all intents and purposes, the deal would not contort our idea. For all intents and purposes, the deal would contort our idea and turn us into a consulting firm, not what any of us had signed up to do or become. And then he goes on, the deal had already been signed. I had to determine whether or not I was going to go back on our company's word in order to save our product roadmap, vision, and culture. Breaking the deal would tarnish our deal-making reputation, increase our financial stress. However, breaking the deal would allow us to stay true to our desires and vision. And he goes on a little bit more, but in this point, I remember that situation, remember the debates. I think the disengagement with the potential partner was done in a very graceful way. It was very early. I use the word graceful again, sorry to overuse it, but it was done early in the project. So nobody was really vested in the project yet. It was just that the agreement had been made to do the project. And Judd did a great job of hitting it head on with this potential customer and saying, look, this really isn't our business, and I don't think we're the right people for you. And we'll help you try to find like an answer here, but we're not the right ones to do this, and disengaged from it. I would then say for GNIP's business going forward, the company was very clear all along the way that they would not work without delight in their labor. They were very fastidious, and they really focused on the work itself being the reward. And the culture of GNIP, the company, reflected that, and how they built their business reflected that. And it really came from probably that moment, because in the absence of that decision, probably the company would have failed, because they would have gotten off their product vision. They wouldn't have focused on the one thing that made the difference, which was the execution of the technology build with Twitter, so that GNIP could actually be a front end for the Twitter fire hose, and doing it in a way that was scalable across many, many customers.
Do you have a go-to?
Yeah, I'll do one of my favorites.
Yeah,
if you read my blog, you've seen it, but it's one that it's one of my favorites. It's called Monsters. And I think this applies to every aspect of our life, not just entrepreneurship. He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. And if thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee. And in other words, if your opponents are bad people, there is a risk you will also become a bad person. If you become too familiar with bad behavior, it may start to seem normal and infect your own thinking. And if you ponder that in the context of your business and who you work with, your competitors, your customers, people around you, and you think about people who you view as bad actors, or who you view, companies that you view behave in ways that are disingenuous, that are one of my favorite investment banker language that I learned many years ago from one of my Mobius partners, Rex Golding, is grin fucking. where people constantly, tell you how awesome something is and then turn around and stab you in the back, or how lead you along in a certain path and then undermine you. For me, I think whenever somebody puts an adjective in front of or an adverb in front of, basically modifies a descriptor of what they are, and it's usually adjectives, that they're usually the opposite of that. Here's one of my favorite ones. If you've ever heard an investor, a VC, say to you, "I'm a value-added investor," you should immediately question whether they're value-added or not. They should show, not tell. They should show through their behavior, through their reputation, through what they do. And people show you who they are and what they are through their behavior. And interpreting that correctly is challenging. A lot of times people will interpret something that is very bad as actually it's just a reflection of their problems. Or somebody will interpret something as very good as a reflection of their aspirations. So if you go back to this quote, how important it is to sort of process it. He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. We all fight with monsters. Monsters are everywhere. Be careful. If thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee. If you engage with the monsters and keep engaging with the monsters and partner with the monsters and befriend the monsters, sometime at some point, that's going to start to reflect on you. And one of the reasons it's so powerful for me, again, coming to this context of I'm about to turn 56. I've been really fortunate. I've had a lot of success. I've had a lot of failure. Come from a very privileged position. I grew up, middle class in Dallas, Texas. I have 2 loving parents. I got a great education. I find myself at age 56 reflecting on the last, 36 years of my business career. And when I reflect on some of those things and I think about, wow, did I behave with regard to a whole series of issues in a way that I felt was the best way I could have behaved with regard to those issues? Or was it a result of who I was working with or who I was working against or who I was engaged with? And it could be on a whole series of behavioral things. It could be around gender diversity, racial diversity. It could be around inclusivity of how I engaged with people. Was I listening to the feedback and the criticism with the right kind of lens, knowing all of that stuff, knowing that when one is in a very powerful position, they're not going to get as much critical feedback as they might otherwise get? Absolutely. When I reflect on myself, absolutely not. I mean, there's a lot of my history. I like to believe that I'm not a monster, but there's a lot of my history that was influenced in moments in time by me gazing into the abyss too much and not recognizing that I was just simply gazing into the abyss at the time.
So we only have time for 1 or 2 more. I think both you and I are sort of fierce advocates for entrepreneur mental health and making sure that folks really take care of themselves. One of the quotes that I was thinking about and that might be relevant there is around stepping back and taking stock and not just sort of, well, I'll let you dig in a little bit, but I think it's appropriate with regards to mental health.
This one is a good example of a more difficult translation. So I'm gonna chunk it into a couple of pieces. It's short. When it is necessary to part, you must, for a time at least, part from that which you want to know and measure. Only when you have left a city do you see how high its towers rise above its houses. So the difficult word there is the word part. And what, I think Nietzsche means there is create distance from. Or in other words, is when you should get away, you must occasionally get away from the things you want to know and measure. You cannot see how high a city skyscrapers skyscrapers rise above the houses until you have left it. Some of this is the cliche, you can't see the forest for the trees. But for me, more importantly, it's sort of this notion of really stepping back, really disconnecting from what's happening on the day-to-day basis, whether it's in the context of what's happening daily and your daily flow and work. So giving yourself time each day to be able to think about what's going on from a position of a leader, or giving yourself a real break, whether that break is a digital Sabbath, from Friday night to Sunday morning being disconnected, or whether it's a week of vacation, or whether it's a long weekend with a loved one, but really, really parting, really, really disconnecting from everything else. It's, not feeling like you have to be on your phone and your email and your texts and your Instagram and your Facebook and whatever's going on. And not just the sort of health of digital hygiene kind of thing, but for your ability as a leader and a thinker to be able to have the time and space to really concentrate on what you're trying to do, and recognize that if you spend no time stepping back, you won't ever see the skyscrapers. You'll lose perspective on where you are and what's going on.
Love it. How about some final thoughts, some questions perhaps that, or quotes that have not been addressed in all of your interviews around this, or anything that you would, some concluding statement as we get on with the rest of Denver Startup Week here?
Well, I'll just end with a little bit where we started. Like, the goal here was very much to provoke, with this book, was to provoke thought, not to provide answers. And I would really encourage all of you, in the context of entrepreneurship, not just in the context of Denver Startup Week, but including in that, to be on your own search for meaning and how that meaning applies to you, rather than a search simply for answers and a search for people who will tell you answers. You can get lots of answers from lots of people. Many of them are wrong. Some of the people you get answers from are monsters. Sometimes you'll be too close to it to actually hear the answer, and on and on and on. And so it's not necessarily saying, here's what you should do. It's, hey, here's another way to spend a little time thinking about how you should be. And if we do any of that with this book, we've been successful with it. If you've read any of my other books, Dave and I tried hard to make this accessible. So all the other books I've written, they're written in very sort of very easy to read, easy to process language, rather than being an academic book or a more formal book. They're meant to be read quickly, easily, without being stumbled on and really having to dig deep endlessly into understanding what the pieces are. So hopefully you get that from it too. And if you do decide to read it, drop me a note and tell me what you think. And if you have any questions or feedback, I'm always ears.
There we go. So the book is The Entrepreneur's Weekly Nietzsche. Thank you, Brad. Thanks to all the sponsors and organizers and volunteers for Denver Startup Week, for myself, Dave Mayer, and Brad Feld. Thank you all, and hope you have a great 10th Denver Startup Week. Thanks for being here.
Dave, thanks for doing this with me, and everybody have a great week, and thanks for being here.